Today, we're diving into the lives of people who were literally broken by prison, delving into 10 of the most severe injuries ever recorded behind bars, exploring real cases and their different outcomes, from men transferred straight from a wheelchair to the electric chair, to inmates left permanently paralyzed after violent encounters with guards or other prisoners, alongside the case of a man blinded in his sleep and a guard left permanently deaf after a brutal assault by a convicted inmate. Today's first story explores one of the largest prison injury settlements in the United States. Seth Fletcher was 18 years old when he was incarcerated at Chillicothe Correctional Institution, a state prison south of Columbus, Ohio. He was meant to serve a 2-year sentence. According to Fletcher's attorneys, the offense involved a consensually made videotape with his underage girlfriend. It was a crime that carried a prison sentence, but what followed was an outcome no judge ever ordered. In April 2020, Fletcher was involved in an encounter with correctional officers inside the facility. According to reporting by CBS News and court filings, the incident began during a strip search. Guards caught Fletcher with a cigarette they suspected was laced with drugs. He was handcuffed and taken to the medical clinic shortly after 6 p.m. The trouble started during the escort from the clinic to the segregated housing unit. Corrections officer Christopher Coy said Fletcher tried to pull away from him. When Coy failed to take Fletcher down with a leg sweep, he tackled violently the handcuffed inmate to the ground. Fletcher said he knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. He couldn't move his legs. His neck hurt. Guards picked him up, face down, by his arms and legs and carried him back to the clinic. The nurse patted his back and neck and decided Fletcher was okay to be taken to segregation. Again, face down and handcuffed, guards carried Fletcher by his arms and legs through the yard, dropping him along the way. Staff eventually brought out a backboard to finish the trip to the segregated housing unit. The cameras in that area were not operating that day. Once inside, guards dropped him on his face again before placing him on a bed in a suicide watch cell. His right arm hung limply over the side of the bed. Fletcher repeatedly said that he couldn't move and asked for water. Guards poured it on his face, waterboarding him. It wasn't until 10 in the morning of the next day, when psychologist Eric Anderson visited the cell, that medical help was finally summoned. Fletcher was transported to Ohio State Wexner Medical Center, where he underwent emergency spinal surgery. Medical records later confirmed the damage. Seth Fletcher had suffered catastrophic spinal injuries. He was left quadriplegic. From that moment on, he could no longer walk. He could no longer use his arms or legs. He required permanent medical care and assistance for basic bodily functions. He did not leave prison early because of his condition. He left prison changed by it. The legal fight came later. Fletcher filed a civil lawsuit against the state of Ohio, alleging that excessive force by correctional officers caused irreversible injury. The state did not take the case to trial. Instead, Ohio agreed to a $17.5 million settlement. It was one of the largest prison injury settlements in the state's history. In the year following his injury, the state prison department fired 3 employees and issued 1-day working suspensions to 2 others. 6 additional staff members resigned. 1 lieutenant took medical retirement. Seth Fletcher went to prison to serve time. He left it permanently disabled. This second case centers on a man once described as the most prolific serial killer in United States history. Juan Vallejo Corona was born in 1934 in Mexico. He first entered the United States illegally in 1950 at the age of 16, crossing the California border. Over the following years, his life moved between instability and opportunity. In January 1956, after what was described at the time as a schizophrenic episode, Corona was committed to DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type. During his confinement, he received 23 electroconvulsive therapy sessions. After 3 months, he was declared recovered and released. Shortly afterward, he was deported to Mexico. In 1962, Corona returned to the United States legally after receiving a green card. He rebuilt his life and became a licensed labor contractor, responsible for hiring and supplying farm workers to fruit ranches across Northern California. That position gave him access, and it gave him victims. In May 1971, a farm owner along the Feather River in Sutter County noticed a freshly dug hole in a peach orchard. The following day, the hole was filled. Inside it was the body of a man who had been stabbed and hacked. As investigators searched the surrounding orchards, they made a discovery that shocked the country. A total of 25 transient laborers were found buried in the area. Corona had supplied workers to the very ranches where the bodies were discovered. He was arrested, charged, and convicted of the murders. At the time, Juan Corona was considered the most prolific serial killer in United States history, a distinction he held until the later discovery of Dean Corll's crimes. Now let's break down why Juan Corona belongs in this episode. In December 1973, 2 years into his life sentence, Corona bumped into another inmate in a prison corridor. He failed to say "excuse me." The encounter escalated. Another inmate later attacked him inside his cell. Corona attempted to defend himself. He was stabbed 32 times, including 2 direct wounds to the eyes. During the assault, one blade destroyed his left eye. Another became permanently lodged behind his right eye. Corona survived the attack, but the damage was irreversible. Juan Corona spent the next 5 decades of his life almost blind, continuing to serve his sentence behind bars, and died in prison in 2019. Very little is publicly recorded about Charles Stamper's life before prison. What is documented is how it ended. Charles Stamper entered the Virginia prison system already sentenced to die. In 1978, Stamper was convicted of a triple murder committed during a robbery, a crime that resulted in a death sentence. The details of the case placed him on Virginia's death row, where he would spend years awaiting execution. Death row is designed for isolation. But in 1988, while still awaiting execution, Stamper became involved in a violent encounter with other inmates on death row. According to documented reporting cited by Amnesty International, the confrontation escalated into a severe physical beating. The injuries were catastrophic. Charles Stamper suffered partial and irreversible paralysis as a result of the assault. From that moment on, his body no longer functioned as it had. He could not walk normally. He could not move freely. His independence was gone. Stamper did not leave death row after the beating. He remained there, now confined not only by sentence, but by his own body. For the remaining years of his life, Charles Stamper existed in a state of near total physical dependence. Movement required assistance. Daily existence was reduced to immobility. The state did not reconsider his sentence. The courts did not intervene. The punishment continued exactly as ordered. In 1993, 5 years after the beating that left him paralyzed, Charles Stamper was executed by the state of Virginia. He was carried through the final years of his life, unable to move his body in any meaningful way. Charles Stamper died having spent his final years not just condemned, but physically broken by the place meant only to hold him. Prior to the execution of Stamper, the last execution of a paraplegic prisoner occurred in 1959 when convicted murderer Frank Wojciechowicz was executed by the state of Connecticut via the electric chair. Now for the case of Frank Wojciechowicz. He didn't become disabled behind bars, but on his way to prison. Frank grew up in a Polish neighborhood of New Britain, Connecticut. Although details of his childhood are scarce, Wojciechowicz was known to have an extensive criminal history that began early in life. By 1951, Frank was a lifetime crook living in Maine. He was 34 years old at the time of the crime that would define the rest of his life. That day, he traveled from Maine to Connecticut to visit his family, but on his way, he decided to take part in an armed robbery. He armed himself with a short-barreled revolver and entered a store on Washington Street at about 5:30 p.m. Frank forced the 2 employees present at gunpoint to open a safe, stealing cash and other valuables. As the robbery unfolded, another individual escaped and alerted authorities after witnessing the holdup. During the ensuing events, a police officer and a civilian bystander were fatally shot. As police moved to arrest him, Frank was shot by law enforcement. The gunfire severed his spinal cord. He survived, but he was left paralyzed from the waist down. He entered the criminal justice system already disabled. That left the robber alive, and it left Connecticut with a very uncomfortable case. His guilt was not in question, and the death sentence for his 2 murder convictions was mandated by law. But the prospect of putting a permanently paralyzed man into the state's electric chair was so aesthetically discomforting that his legal odyssey dragged on for nearly 8 years, at a time when the median death penalty case resulted in execution within 15 months. He had to be tried in a prison hospital bed. Connecticut officials were likely hoping that the killer's injuries would take his life naturally before it came to that, but he kept hanging on. And not only that, he fought for his life both in the courts and in the court of public opinion. Frank passed his time feeding pigeons through barred windows. He lobbied for life, arguing in letters to supporters that his paralysis was a greater punishment than death, and calling state execution the evil of evils. Frank Wojciechowicz spent the years leading up to his execution confined to prison in a wheelchair. Daily movement required assistance. His body no longer functioned independently. Despite his condition, the state moved forward. In 1959, Frank Wojciechowicz was executed by electrocution in Connecticut. He was pushed to the execution chamber, lifted from his wheelchair, and placed into the electric chair. A wooden box was used as a stool to support his paralyzed legs. This following case explored the tragic story of Cheryl Weimar, a 52-year-old woman. In 2019, Cheryl was incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution, a state prison for women in Central Florida. Weimar had been convicted of battery with a deadly weapon and resisting an officer with violence. She was serving a 6-year prison sentence with a projected release date in 2021. She entered prison to serve that sentence. In August, that sentence changed in a way no judge ever ordered. The incident occurred while Weimar was on work duty at the prison in Marion County. She was instructed to clean toilets in one of the confinement areas. Because she was experiencing pain from a pre-existing hip condition, she was unable to perform the task. After informing officers about her pain, they became angry, and a confrontation ensued. According to the lawsuit, correctional officers slammed Weimar to the ground, where they brutally beat her, striking her head, neck, and back. At least one officer elbowed her in the back of the neck, breaking it. The officers then dragged Weimar like a rag doll to a nearby wheelchair, allowing her head to bounce along the ground. They brought her outside the prison compound, continuing the assault outside the view of surveillance cameras. The injury was immediate and catastrophic. Cheryl Weimar is now a quadriplegic. Having lost the ability to use her arms and legs, she was hospitalized after the attack. She now breathes through a tracheostomy. She receives nutrition through a PEG tube inserted into her stomach. Cheryl Weimar is currently being cared for at a hospital in Ocala, Florida. She did not complete her sentence as intended. She left prison permanently disabled. The legal fight came afterward. Weimar filed a civil lawsuit against the state of Florida, alleging that excessive force by correctional officers caused irreversible injury. The state did not take the case to trial. Instead, Florida agreed to a $4.65 million settlement, a figure widely reported by multiple outlets. Meanwhile, the 4 officers accused of beating Weimar remain employed by the prison system. Though they have been reassigned to duties that do not involve inmate contact, their names have not been made public. The settlement did not restore her mobility. It acknowledged responsibility. So this next case feels straight out of a movie scene. The following event happened in 2015 in the Florida State Prison. Imagine being 64 years old, serving a sentence for a nonviolent drug possession charge. You keep your head down, biding your time. One day, the prison officials assign you a new cellmate, a younger prisoner with a history of violence toward cellmates. This violent streak is well known among the inmates and prison officials. You remind the prison officials of this violent pattern, but they brush you off. You are powerless. One night, you are asleep on your bunk. Suddenly, you wake up writhing in pain. The pain is sharp and intense. You realize that this pain is radiating from one of your eyes that you can no longer see from. You discover that, as the pain in your eye increases, your vision does not. Your cellmate is standing over you with a bloody pair of scissors. This gruesome act of violence was an unfortunate reality for prisoner Mackie Shivers, the victim of his cellmate's attack in 2015. The blindness was irreversible. Shivers did not leave prison because of the injury. His sentence continued. The legal fight came afterward. Mackie Shivers filed a lawsuit under the Federal Tort Claims Act, alleging that prison officials failed to protect him despite prior warnings about his cellmate's behavior. The case reached the federal appeals level. The court ultimately rejected his lawsuit on immunity grounds, ruling that the government could not be held liable under the specific legal framework invoked. The ruling did not dispute the facts of the attack. He did not dispute the injury. It only closed the door to compensation. Mackie Shivers went to prison to serve time. He left that cell permanently blinded in one eye, and his case stands as a modern example of how a single moment of unchecked violence inside prison can result in lifelong disability, even when no legal remedy follows. Robert Brooks was 43 years old, serving a 12-year prison sentence for violent offenses inside New York State custody. On December 9th, 2024, Brooks was transferred from Mohawk to Marcy Correctional Facility. Transfers like this are routine. What happened next was not. Brooks was brought to a medical examination room inside Marcy Correctional Facility. He was handcuffed and seated on an examination table. Body camera footage later showed that the right side of his face was already bleeding. Despite this, he appeared compliant. Suddenly, multiple correctional officers began striking Brooks repeatedly, hitting his face, torso, and groin, all while he remained restrained. He was handcuffed. He was seated. Several other officers stood inside the room as passive bystanders. As the assault continued, Brooks became unresponsive. 2 officers then lifted his motionless body by his shirt, attempting to throw him out of a nearby window. The attempt failed. Brooks was placed back onto the examination table. An officer performed a sternal rub, a painful medical stimulus used to check for consciousness. Brooks did not respond. He was transported to Wynn Hospital in Utica, New York. He died the following morning on December 10, 2024. An autopsy ruled his death a homicide. The medical conclusion was direct. Robert Brooks died from a massive beating. The response from the state came quickly. After an internal review, the governor of New York directed the Department of Corrections to terminate 13 correctional officers and a prison nurse involved in the incident. In total, 17 employees, including 4 sergeants and 2 nurses, were suspended. On February 2025, prosecutors filed criminal charges. 6 correctional officers were charged with murder, gang assault, manslaughter, and tampering with evidence. 4 additional employees faced charges including manslaughter and evidence tampering. Robert Brooks did not become disabled behind bars, but the outcome was worse. He was killed there. This case is different. This time, the person left permanently disabled was not a prisoner. It was a guard. Matthew Tidman was 40 years old. He was a correctional officer with the Massachusetts Department of Correction. Before the attack, his life followed a strict routine. Daily security checks, controlled movement, maintaining order inside a system built to contain violence. In August 2022, Tidman was on duty at MCI Shirley, a maximum security prison in central Massachusetts. That day, he entered the prison gym. What happened next unfolded in seconds. According to prosecutors and multiple news reports, inmate Roy Booth attacked Tidman using a heavy piece of gym equipment. The object was swung with enough force to cause catastrophic head injuries. Tidman collapsed. The assault was sudden, it was brutal, and it was irreversible. Matthew Tidman survived, but he did not recover. Medical reporting described a traumatic brain injury, followed by severe and lasting complications. The damage affected his cognitive function, his physical stability, his ability to live and work as he had before. Matthew Tidman was left permanently disabled. This was not an injury that faded with time. It became a permanent condition. The legal response came later. The Middlesex District Attorney announced that Roy Booth pleaded guilty to mayhem and armed assault with intent to murder. Booth received a 13 to 15-year prison sentence in Massachusetts to be served concurrently with a life sentence he was already serving in Virginia for murder. The sentence continued. The damage did not reverse. In the years that followed, reporting noted that Tidman became an advocate for restrictions on prison gym equipment, warning that everyday objects inside prison walls can become weapons. His body became part of the evidence. Matthew Tidman did not enter prison as an inmate. He entered as staff. He did not leave in a body bag, but he left permanently changed. This case matters because it exposes a truth rarely acknowledged. Prison violence does not stop at the cell door. It can disable the people charged with controlling it, and once that line is crossed, the institution is no longer just punishing bodies. It is breaking them on both sides of the bars. Very little separated Khalif Browder from an ordinary life before his arrest. He grew up in the Bronx, New York City, raised by his family attending school with no conviction on his record. He was a teenager when the justice system intervened. In 2010, Khalif Browder was 16 years old when he was arrested. He was accused of stealing a backpack. He maintained his innocence. Because his family could not afford bail, Browder was sent to Rikers Island, New York City's main jail complex, to await trial. The trial never came. Khalif Browder spent nearly 3 years in custody without being convicted of a crime. During that time, he was held in jail cells designed for adults, and for roughly 700 days, he was placed in solitary confinement. Solitary meant isolation, locked alone in his cell for up to 23 hours a day. No meaningful human contact, no school, no trial date. Reporting later documented repeated physical altercations with other inmates and guards, but the deepest damage was not visible. It was psychological. Browder described hallucinations, paranoia, anxiety, a sense that his mind was unraveling. Video footage later released showed guards beating him during one altercation, but the defining harm came from time itself, years of waiting, years of isolation, years without resolution. In 2013, prosecutors dropped all charges against Khalif Browder. He was released. There was no conviction, no sentence served. But the damage did not end at the jail gate. After his release, Browder struggled with severe depression and post-traumatic stress. He attempted suicide multiple times. On June 6, 2015, Khalif Browder died by suicide at the age of 22. His case did not end quietly. Public reporting and investigations tied his psychological collapse directly to his incarceration and prolonged solitary confinement. His death became a national symbol of what extended pretrial detention can do to the mind. Khalif Browder did not leave prison physically disabled, but his mind did not survive the experience, and his case stands as one of the clearest documented examples of incarceration destroying a person psychologically, even in the absence of a conviction. This last case is different, but interesting because the disability did not come from violence, but from negligence. Vannaranhar was in his early 20s when he entered the federal prison system in 2011 for selling 2 stolen weapons to an undercover officer. At the time, he had near-perfect vision. He was sentenced under federal law and entered custody to serve that sentence. At the time he entered prison, Nahar was not blind. What followed was not sudden violence, it was slow damage. While incarcerated, Nahar started suffering from glaucoma, a serious eye condition that requires consistent monitoring and specialist care to prevent vision loss. According to reporting by Prison Legal News, Nahar repeatedly complained about deteriorating vision and requested proper ophthalmological treatment. That care did not come in time. As his condition progressed, Nahar's eyesight worsened dramatically. The damage became irreversible. By the time he left custody, Vannaranhar was nearly blind. This was not the result of a single assault. It was the result of alleged medical neglect inside a system responsible for his care. Nahar did not receive early release because of his disability. His sentence continued. The legal response came afterward. Vannaranhar filed a civil lawsuit alleging that federal prison officials failed to provide adequate medical treatment for a known and progressive condition. The case did not result in a criminal conviction. Instead, it ended in a civil settlement, reported at $2.6 million. Public reporting framed the resolution clearly. The payment was not a disability-based release. It was compensation for harm already done. Vannaranhar entered prison able to see. He left it nearly blind. And his case stands as one of the clearest documented examples of incarceration, not just restraining the body, but slowly disabling it through neglect, while the sentence itself remained unchanged. All right, fam, that wraps up today's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you enjoyed it, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Get ready for weekly episodes diving into some of the most unbelievable true stories you've ever heard, across a wide range of topics, all illustrated and backed by sources, so don't forget to hit the notification bell. Big love to everyone who stuck around till now. Peace out, and see you real soon.